Okay, rulers, settle down. Ruler School is brought to you by Odyssey Games, where you can go to get pre-orders of all the upcoming Force of Will sets, as well as releases of previous sets after they come out. TCGprime.com with over 100,000 Force of Will singles, as well as out-of-print boxes from the past, and TCG accessories, as well as fowlibrary.com, a wonderful resource for deck lists, article discussions, and more. Check them out at fowlibrary.com, as well as these amazing patrons. Special thanks to guest lecturer patrons Shukong Fu, Vite Ramen, and Maxime Van He. Thank you for your support. Class is in session. Hey, the Rulers, Demo73 here, bringing you a feature match for the week thanks to Paul, between himself playing Providence, Bahamut, Violet versus Manuel playing Turbulence Burn. Just as a reminder, currently there are pre-orders up for Hero Cluster Set 1, Starter Decks, and Main Set at Odyssey Games. You can check the link in the description to go do that. And if you're looking for a fun event to go to later this year, come check us out in Kalamazoo, Michigan at the Force of Will Festival, November 5th and 6th, with amazing sponsors, Inked Gaming, Vite Ramen, Odyssey Games, and TCG Prime. We have amazing pricing here. $1,000 cash guaranteed, pricing down to top 64. Amazing entry promotions, entry promos at multiple different tiers, all kinds of fun surprises. It's going to be an amazing event. You definitely want to get checking it out. So we're going to go ahead and jump in here. The main difference between these two lists is kind of what they're playing to win con, right? With the alternative or the combination ban list, you can either play Turbulence or you can't play both. You can't play Turbulence and Bahamut. So one of these decks is using Turbulence to try to win or accelerate a win con, and replacing Turbulence or Bahamut with Firestorm, and the other one is playing setting the stage of Providence to replace Turbulence to be able to protect the Bahamut playline. So this is going to be a first couple turns of just basic setup, both players using Eternal Wind, Paul throwing down that Tiny Violet and choosing to actually leave the Eternal Wind in the graveyard. Some conversations we were having with Paul is that early Tiny Violets, you kind of just want to keep the atoms in grave, because sometimes, you know, you just want them in grave and you don't have as great a way to be able to accelerate discard them as fast. So you don't always need to necessarily be grabbing them back with Tiny Violet if you can help it. Manuel going to throw down a Everfrost here before recovery so that he can draw some extra card value here. It's going to be a lot of atoms thrown back and forth. It's going to be who can make use of the good field control, as also graveyard setup and draw power that these decks bring, to be able to see who can get to their big finisher first. Going to use a Violet effect in the main phase here. And then another Everfrost to draw more cards. We're eventually going to see a point where, based on the number of Everfrosts discarded, we might start to see just discards due to hand size at end of turn. We see Paul using Tiny Violet here to go ahead and discard White Garden, which gains him 1,000 life. So now we're at 2 uniques. Before recovery on Paul's turn, we're going to see a Atomic Turbulence come down. This is going to get to kill the Tiny Violet, as well as lock Paul out for the turn, and also just take away that 1,000 life. So a nice little board clear that also kind of stuns Paul for a bit. It's not necessarily a big play. I think it might have been better to wait to save that Turbulence until Paul went for a Providence. But it's also a good way to just make sure that Paul stays in lethal range for things like Firestorm. We see an Everfrost come down from Paul's Violet activation on his turn. And then just simply a pass. Both of these decks have a lot of really good removal. I mean, Atoms still have an amazing, are still an amazing tool to be able to keep the board clear, even if the fact that they don't have heart-to-heart talk as well. That's a big indicator here, so you can see kind of the pacing that New Age Violet is in Wanderer without having heart-to-heart available. Down comes an improved burning robot. This is going to get to buy back quite a few. It's a really good way to refill. Also, this is just a really good early game pressure without having to rely on Bahamut to deal a lot of damage. It's very easy to make improved burning robot very, very large very, very quickly. The problem is there again, Paul has a lot of, just like most Violet decks, has a lot of ways to just be able to kill it. Something like Gradius or Dark Providence. Or even something simple as Magical Loveliness to be able to tap it down so it can't get the counters. We are going to see the retaliation, though, in the terms of a Violet activation to discard Brave Force. So this is going to give that guy swiftness and barrier, and he will be able to swing in protected with a lot of atoms in hand. So this is going to be potentially quite a bit of damage. Revealing just 4, choosing to reveal just 4 atoms there, so he'll get 8 counters. I think it might just be 1+1+1 counter. I'm trying to remember exactly. And then taking a grand total of 17 damage there, it looks like. And then before recovery, we are going to see Paul say, you know what, I have the Dark Providence there. Let's go ahead before you can save it and kill it. I think there's a world where if he had the Dark Providence, we should have used the Dark Prominence as the discard before the Gradius, so that if there was a Brave Force in response, we could then use Coin to cast the Gradius. Ultimately, though, he's fully tapped out, so we can just see setting the stage of Providence into an Atomic Bahamut that can't be canceled, although he's tapped out. So we did get the successful Atom set up, and then Bahamut's still going to come down and just swing in for 40 and close the game out there. And with that, we go into game 2. So a little bit of a slow start from Turbulence Burn there, just not seeing good, kept the board clear, sure, but just didn't see the right combinations of atoms and didn't see enough follow-up to be able to get the closer. Certainly not seeing a Firestorm does not help. Because between two decks that don't have a lot of creatures to swing in other than their bombs, that leaves a lot of spot removal for the mirror to be able to kill the things that do come down. So you got to really play safe with those Brave Forces, play smart with those Brave Forces in a way to be able to close out. And also just want to make sure it's kind of a weird state where these are both, as much as they're red decks, they're both operating kind of as control decks that are just doing a lot of setup so that they can then do a control-y one-shot by having the right tools in hand and having the graveyard set up properly. So not a lot of aggression coming down from either of these decks, although there are some ways that you can play more aggressive with Violet with things like Mechanization. That's a new card that's been brought out in set 3 of Dual Cluster that can do some pretty cool things with improved Burning Robot or Tiny Violet or all kinds of kind of cool stuff. See that Eternal Wind there. We do see an Atomic Reactor, something we haven't seen in a lot of Violet decks for quite some time. It does get him access to any atom he wants, which is nice to be able to grab like a Dark Prominence or something like a Void. Void could be very beneficial in the mirror, especially since Paul, unlike the Turbulence Burn, Paul has to have his atoms in the graveyard when he's trying to cast Bahamut, and Bahamut doesn't ever have swiftness, whereas Turbulence Burn, Firestorm's quick cast, so it can do some pretty cool things there to be able to it's not as vulnerable to void, because you're just can like discard and hold priority to then RF remove them from the game, or in response to a void remove things from the game. Paul's setting up his Tiny Violet again here, so he has twice the activations. Like, hey, I don't get to activate for free once per turn, so I'll just have 2 activations per turn. How does that sound? It's a very handy tool, and again, it's one of those things where it's probably worth burning immediately, but, you know, does Turbulence Burn have the tools to be able to get it out of hand right now? Popping a coin to go ahead and use Violet Effect, and yeah, there we do have the Dark Prominence, so we get that Tiny Violet off the board before it can start generating that additional value for Paul. Because in that, if Providence has Tiny Violet but Turbulence doesn't, I mean, Paul's just going to accelerate so much faster, get so much further ahead in terms of the diversity of atoms, and then there's not going to really be a way to close it out from there. The weird thing about this is, like, you see how they both are kind of willing to play things in main phase, because they only need 1 will to be able to interact usually during their opponent's turn, especially Turbulence, for instance. It's seeming like it's a very heavy red base, so we like use a Violet activation on our turn, leave up a stone to be able to use a Violet activation during your turn, and then it's kind of always this like 1 up 1 down value there. I think that Paul's Providence deck gets a little bit more value out of that, especially because as it gets more stones, it has more cheaper things to be able to make use of that will with. Oh yeah, it definitely seems like Turbulence needs a more atoms in hand, it seems like, because he discarded to hand size, but then realized, oh wait, his max hand size is 1 more. Just not seeing a lot of atoms necessarily. So we see a Violet discard from Paul to then get an Everfrost to draw another card, to then draw a card for turn. So just so many cards in hand. And finally get to see a new tool that kind of additionally helps with playing more interaction, as making use of those Moonshades as well, is we are playing Origins of the 7 Lands in this deck to be able to reveal Drywing. So Drywing is going to get to recover the stone while producing him that 1 green will. And now what it means is he can use the Violet effect with also leaving up all of his stones. This is great for the fact that, again, Paul's playing those Moonshades, and so he can just hard cast off-color atoms, which can actually make a big difference. So we discard a White Garden using that green, going back up to 4,600 life. So the Drywing itself doesn't really do too much in the mirror. I mean, there's not a lot of additional will production going on that isn't from the stones. You don't really have to worry about anything like that. But it does, again, give just Paul more resources to be able to use during his opponent's turn, while also being able to use Violet. This can set up for things like being able to play a Tiny Violet. This can set up for things like being able to play Black Witch, Witch of the Fallen Kingdom. This also gives us the ability to set up for, you know, hard casting a Void, hard casting a Dark Prominence. The more flexibility he has to be able to manipulate the game state, manipulate the graveyard, the better. Especially, hopefully, he maybe has more White Gardens, because if he can keep his life total higher, or this could also set up into being able to do, you know, if he has a red card in his sideboard, this could set him up to be able to do like a very quick Judgment of Violet, which could then also really help close out the games, right? You use the Atom Stone, float red, use and then try to like set up, I guess it doesn't really matter because you need something. Yeah, that wouldn't work as much as I thought, but we can use Origins to be able to kind of filter a little bit, which can be helpful. Paul's deck is also probably better primed to be able to make use of a Violet flip, because of the fact that you can like discard all of the atoms to be able to push in pressure with Violet, and then if they do try to eventually answer it, you're like, well, I spent all that time throwing my Violets to the grave, or my atoms to the grave. Now that you've answered it, here's a Baha. Close out the game. So it could be a playthrough that really helps, where it's certainly the same potential on Manuel's side, Turbulence Burn side, but it feels a little bit riskier because he has to kind of proactively commit, which could feel a little weird. We see an Atomic Turbulence here during the recovery phase. Saying, please get yourself below 4,000 life so that I can Firestorm you. 10 different atoms with Firestorm is lethal. We've seen that before with some of the Violet decks we've put on the channel. Paul discarding Providence due to hand size there. Oh, it seems like that Turbulence was thrown out at the end of Paul's turn. That's very interesting. Ironically enough, Turbulence doesn't do actually a whole lot in the mirror because it doesn't stop you from using Violet Effect. It doesn't stop you from discarding atoms. It does hurt. Again, it does hurt Paul more so because it gives him a way to be able to just say, you can't cast Bahamut this turn. But again, that's where I'm saying like the availability of flipping over Violet could also play in a big factor. Dark Prominence gets discarded off of Violet Effect. He says, no, I don't think you have another Brave Force. Let's go ahead and kill it. Try to kill that guy before, in response to his trigger to bring you back all your atoms. And that's going to happen. So he's going to die. Handful of atoms. With different names. Just reloading the hand. 6 back to hand. Oh, we see there is that Firestorm in hand. That's a big deal. Now I wonder if there is going to be enough in hand with 2 will to do lethal here. Discard due to hand size. And say pass. Seems like. And then, looks like we're doing something on Paul's turn before recovery. This is a little bit risky, but we are going to see. Oh, we're saying, okay, we're going to do a Firestorm. Or sorry, this Atomic Turbulence. And one thing to note about Atomic Turbulence is you can discard any number of atoms with different names. Typically, you're only discarding 3, but it does say X number of atoms with different names. So if you've got 7 different atoms in hand, you can discard all 7. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those 6 that we bought back are all automatically being discarded back to the graveyard. And that's going to attempt to deal 1,000 damage and silence Paul for the turn. Paul says, okay, well, before that anything happens there, I'll use Violet Effect to try to draw. We discarded Eternal Wind, which is going to recover him a stone, and then he's going to use that Moonshade, pinning himself down to 34 to try to void the graveyard. And this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the advantage the Turbulence has in the matchup, is that its win con is instant speed. And so what we can do is we can use Firestorm here, banishing the banish the Firestone as well, but that's 1, 2, 3, counting the number of atoms. Just for the sake of math, it looks like he's going to go ahead and banish the Atom Stone, although I don't think it matters because Paul's going to also take the 1,000 damage from the Turbulence. But the Firestorm's coming out here. You go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that is 2,800 damage right there. Yeah, 2,800 damage and then an additional 1,000. So that instant speed, we got Paul's life low enough and we're able to trick out in response to the void, throw down a Firestorm, and close out game 2. So going into game 3 here, you've seen that both decks can kind of just close out of nowhere. It does kind of come down to who opens up a better Atom package first, or who can keep the other graveyard open there. It does feel a little bit like Turbulence Burn might be favored because of Instance and Speed Element. It's just a matter of can it accelerate its atoms to the graveyard. And this is certainly an assistant Atomic Reactor, because says, hey, gets you a different atom, or gets you like a second Everfrost to be able to dig further, increases your hand size, does grab that Void early on, which I think is smart because it gives him a way to be able to mess with the Atomic Bahamut lines for Paul. Paul using coin here to go ahead and do Everfrost and then draw for turn. Interesting. So using the coin on Turbulence Burn's turn, just to kind of accelerate a little bit. We do see that Origin of the Seven Lands gets us a Drywing, gets us a stone, lets us use another Violet activation here. That's probably why we went for the coin, just to get a second Violet activation and say, I want to get ahead of you in terms of atoms. Now, Paul does discard Magical Loveliness here and does 400 damage. Technically, he can't. He can discard the... he can discard, and we've recorded it as he's dealt damage because they agreed to it in the match. But technically, to kind of talk about it, you don't have a legal target for Magical Loveliness. So yes, you can discard it, but there's no target for it, so the effect will just whiff. So Turbulence wouldn't even take the 400 damage there. The Tiny Violet out for Paul, did grab the Magical Loveliness back. Does have a way to be able to use Magical Loveliness there. It can just target the Violet, can just target itself with the Magical Loveliness and get the 400 damage through. We'll see if that's what Paul decides to do here. Very much in kind of race mode. Yep, that's exactly what happened. Like I said, we see a discarded Magical Loveliness come down. Another 400 damage there. It can target the Tiny Violet and tap it because it doesn't say your opponent controls. Origin of the Seven Lands comes down. See another Drywing. Use the will from the Drywing reveal to go ahead and do the Violet effects. So now we're set up to be able to do 2 Violet effects during Manuel's turn. Everfrost drawing more cards. Paul probably going to try to take advantage of the lower hand limit here to just discard to hand size. Get some more situational atoms to grave there. See, we're already at 4. And we do know that there is the Void in graveyard, so that's, or Void in hand, so that's certainly something that he has to watch out for. Very real opportunity for that to just be completely removed from the game. And yep, this looks like that's what we're seeing. So down comes the Void to try to remove those atoms from the graveyard. And Paul, using Tiny Violet's effect here in response, does grab second boon Tachyon. And they unfortunately play this incorrectly as well. So currently, Tachyon can't copies target chant spell. The Void, when it's being discarded, puts its ability on the chase as an ability, not a chant. And so technically, Tachyon wouldn't actually duplicate Void here. So that's just a note for those of you who are watching. Technically, Manuel would still have his graveyard, and Paul would just have another atom removed from the game alongside it. It wouldn't actually do anything there. Now, if Manuel had cast the Void, then yes, that would have worked, but he didn't. He discarded it due to Violet's effect. Post Call Stone Violet effect here. We really do need to try to find a way to get that tiny violet off the board. Otherwise, even though we just dealt with the graveyard, Paul's going to fill it up again very, very quickly. Discarding a Firestorm, though, which is not what he wanted to discard. He wants to be able to use those later. Like another Atomic Reactor, his hand must be very starved for atoms at this point, which feels really not good when you're trying to race to get to 5 in the graveyard. Do you see a Tachyon Search? Paul still has a Violet effect to use this turn, so he potentially has a Brave Force to be able to protect his Violet. Tiny Violet, ultimately, though, has a safe turn. Nothing's coming down to try to kill the Violet, so we're just going to discard Eternal Winds to recover that stone, and then be able to move into his turn. Oh, looks like we're going to see a pretty familiar playline that we saw from last game. We are going to see a Atomic Turbulence here. How many atoms are we discarding to try to lock Paul out of a turn? Thinks about discarding the Everfrost, does end up going through with it, discard the full 3, so we're going to deal 1,000 damage, take Paul down to 30, and say you can't cast any spells for the turn. I think this is probably okay for Paul. We're post-recovery, we're going to just see perhaps... if Paul has a Void, this might be a really good time to use it. We're going to see a Violet effect come down, and yep, there's the Void. So now we are going to hit his graveyard again. So that's 2 packets of atoms removed from the graveyard to keep them away from Firestorm. The question becomes, does he play Improved Healing Robot to be able to bring it back? This is where mechanization can come into play. You can turn like a Tiny Violet into an Improved Healing Robot just at instant speed from the deck, which can be very, very helpful, especially since you've lost Mariabella, so that you can't like cast Mariabella and get your 1-drops out of the deck. Just seeing a Call Stone. Feeling pretty starved for atoms here. Violent effects. Do you see a Everfrost there? I imagine we see that get discarded just to get more cards into hand, maybe. There does come a point when you have enough will that a Firestorm, even, a Firestorm is still very castable, because it does count the number of removed from graveyard things anyway. And so, it's the same for Bahamut too. I mean, you're hurting them in the fact that making the cards cost more, but also you're helping them because you have more things removed. So like the things being removed still count towards his total cost, like towards the abilities of those cards. See an Eternal Wind here, and seeing an Atomic Fusion. As an additional cost to pay this card, you have to discard X atoms with different names. You draw 2, discard 1, and then that's the base effect, and then based on the number of atoms it gets more. It does seem like Manuel's just gonna draw 2, discard 1. Really just needs to try to dig into something. Really going in here, banishing both of his Atom Stones just to try to draw into something, hoping that he can draw into a Firestorm. Probably here, there's enough atoms in graveyard that he might be able to hit a Firestorm lethal, with Paul being only at 3,000 life. A Providence Firestorm would be pretty great here. Doesn't seem like he has it though. Unfortunately, if he had The world is looking in there. We do see a Firestorm. We just don't see a Providence. So I think maybe his math might be wrong. Double checking how many atoms we have in graveyard. Really looking at that. How many atoms we have RFG to see what the damage from a Providence or a Firestorm would be. There is an inherent risk though that Paul we know plays White Garden. So if it's close to 3,000 or like just over 3,000, there is a world where maybe Paul either White Gardens to heal up, or maybe even Tachyons to copy the Firestorm to kill him with it, because they both have a lot of atoms removed from game. So you gotta be really careful. Does just say pass. We see Paul during his turn go ahead and use Eternal Wind, and then just hard cast an Everfrost to get another atom in graveyard. Going into his turn, we draw. We see pay 2 to go ahead and cast Setting the Sage of Providence. Again, there's not really much of a way for him to be canceled. And we do see... Wonder if there's any kind of response here. Oh, seems like he does have Atomic Turbulence. Does he have enough atoms to do the full silence is the question. Oh, unfortunately not. Only has 2 atoms there. So it does deal 1,000 damage. Which would take Paul down to 18. He only marks it as 23. It should be full 18. Because it would be 1,000 damage. And then ultimately, he does not have enough atoms in there to follow it up with the Firestorm. And so the Turbulence is going to get to resolve, draws Paul a card. And then at that point in time, we're going to see the Bahamut come down. We can even use that atom to be able to, draw another card and just really secure the free Bahamut. There's certainly more than 5 uniques removed in the graveyard from now. That Atomic Bahamut's going to come down. Using Violet's effects. Oh, to just get another atom to graveyard. Discarding the Brave Force. Very greedy, I think. I think we could have just paid a little bit more for Atomic Bahamut just to keep it safe. But ultimately, the Bahamut's going to come down, and that's going to be lethal. So I hope you guys liked it. Again, check out the links in the descriptions that we have for you in terms of Foul Fest and pre-orders for the next set. And we'll have more stuff for you later this week. So until next time, this is GMO73 saying class dismissed.